All right, then officially welcome everybody to this event hosted by the Young Scholars Initiative, the Young EY Democracy Forum, and of course the New Economics Foundation on EMU fiscal governments saving the balance sheet at the cost of democracy. Today we'll have four great speakers that will address questions such as whether supranational fiscal surveillance can enhance rather than reduce national autonomy, whether expert rule in fiscal policy making is compatible with democratic principles, and to what extent we need to rethink the apolitical nature of fiscal policy in order to manage the greatest challenges of our time. So we're very proud to present Professor Maricut Akbik, who is Assistant Professor of European Politics at Leiden University and currently in Berlin. Francis Coppola, author of the Coppola Comment Finance and Economics blog, which features regularly on news outlets such as the Financial Times and Alphaville. And Professor Nikolaidis, Professor of the School of Transnational Governance at the EY in Florence, and Professor of International Relations at Oxford University. Then, of course, lastly, but certainly not least, Stefano Merlo, who's a PhD student at the John Stuart Mill College of the VU in Amsterdam, and his research combines the studies of the EU's fiscal institutions with democratic theory. I'll be moderating tonight. I'm a colleague of Stefano, also a PhD at John Stuart Mill College and currently visiting the EY, so joining you from Florence. The idea is that all speakers have about 15 minutes to present. Stefano and Professor Nikolaidis will present together, and then after which we can have a discussion, and given the relatively manageable size of this Zoom meeting, perhaps there's also room for questions in between, but we'll see how the debate and the presentations progress. So without much further ado, I'm very happy to have Professor Maricut Akbik start with her presentation.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see my presentation. First, many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart, the democratic character of the Economic and Monetary Union. This is a topic I've been working on for the last 4 years, and I must say from the beginning that I'm coming to this topic from the perspective of political science. I'm a political scientist by training, and I look particularly at the issue of accountability. Yeah, so my talk is going to be conducted from this perspective. The way in which I organize my presentation is around the questions that were raised by the organizers. I'm just going to do them in a different order. So I will start with a little bit of a diagnosis. So how the Economic and Monetary Union, especially fiscal governance, has affected democratic principles in the member states in the European Union more broadly. Then I will briefly discuss this relationship between expert rules, expertise, and democratic principles, and then a bit on ways forward. And the key takeaways from my presentation are two. So the first is that it is fruitless to continuously try to imitate the design of national democracies in the fiscal governance of the Economic Monetary Union. It will always fall short, and we will inevitably be disappointed when it comes to comparing them directly. And the second point that's, of course, related to the first is that we need new principles that allow us to hold EMU institutions accountable, even if they are not politically representative in the way in which we think about representation at the national level. And let me elaborate on this. So first, maybe what do I mean with democracy? I think that's a very important aspect to start such a discussion. The way in which I discuss it here, it's in a very minimalist sense. So democracy with respect to the result of elections. So having, in a way, the way in which we understand, or even common sense, we would understand democracy. Yeah, we have political parties with competing agendas, free elections, and then a government is appointed, and this government can be made on one party or multiple parties, depending on the nature of the party system. And this, they will conduct, in this case, a fiscal policy and all of the other policies of a government. What is the problem with this definition in the EU political system is that, well, there are structural dysfunctions that, if we think of the democratic chain of delegation from voters to elected representatives, well, this chain is either short-circuited in the EU or too sinuous to function properly. And there are two problems here. So at the national level, as voters or national parliaments, we can hold our own finance minister or head of government accountable. We can replace the government through elections, but we cannot do this with the Council, ECOFIN, or the Eurogroup as a whole, because there are no mechanisms of holding democratically accountable intergovernmental institutions in the European Union. And the most blatant example here is probably the Greek referendum of 2015, when, of course, you could say this was a populist referendum and it shouldn't have been triggered in the first place. But ultimately, the result was that you had a clear direct vote for something that was then completely ignored at the EU level. And understandably, this has made the Greek electorate very frustrated. Then we move to the European level, where, we know that the European Union is based on or is functioning as a representative democracy, where European citizens are represented at the EU level through the European Parliament. The problem with the European Parliament is, although it has been significantly empowered in the last 20, 30 years, it's still, especially in the EMU, so in other policy area, it has actually much more power in terms of setting the legislative agenda. In the EMU, it still remains, in my view, at least the third most relevant actor after the Eurogroup, the Commission, then the European Parliament. We could also consider here the European Council would come first, but of course the European Council is not specific to fiscal governance or the EMU. And the problem with the European Parliament comes from, again, the structure of the EU political system, where the issues are two. So first of all, European political groups do not function as transmission belts in the way in which we think of political parties, so transmission belts between citizens' preferences and policy outputs. And here I'm not only talking about the Spitzenkandidat process of 2019, and that it didn't really work out because the current European Commission president did not run in the election in any capacity. What I'm talking about here is that political groups, the way in which they run their campaigns is still quite separate from the EU level. They're mostly debating national issues when it comes to the European Parliament elections. Again, there have been improvements in recent years, but not in all member states. For instance, Central and Eastern European member states still run their European Parliament elections mostly focused on domestic issues. And the other problem is that even if we had this European political groups that would transfer, you would vote for the Greens or the SPD or the EPP or whoever, in the SND, sorry. In this case, you still have so many veto players in the EU political system that your policy preferences have to be negotiated and compromised in such a way that the result might be quite far away from your political preferences. Against this background, we had the Euro crisis and then the COVID crisis, but the Euro crisis had had the most significant impact on the fiscal governance framework of the European Union. And now I will show you a picture that might surprise you a bit. Because this is done, by the way, in the context of a project I've been working on at the Hertie School that's called Leviathan. And that's why this image is a rendering of Thomas Hope's famous cover of his book, Leviathan. And what we try to sort of represent here is this idea that the EU has actually developed a powerful economic executive, maybe not all powerful as the Leviathan, but strong enough. And this is represented through the rule of experts and technocrats that especially in certain member states, this idea is very much resented, yes, that experts get to have such a say in the governance, either economic or social, of the member states. And when we talk about experts, who do we talk about? Well, the European Central Bank on the one hand, the European Commission. Of course, the European Commission also has political leadership, but it is an enormous, also administrative organization. But I would also include here the committee infrastructure of the Council, yeah, that both on the ECOFIN side and on the Eurogroup side. And the sort of metaphor that we were trying to draw here is that, okay, the EU has concentrated a lot of power in the hands of experts during the Euro crisis that are supposed to interpret and decide according to the fiscal rules. But how do we, or can we actually hold them accountable, and how is this compatible with democratic principles? And this takes me to the question that's been raised by the organizers. Can expert rules, and here I would talk about expertise in general before moving to fiscal rules in particular, can they ever be compatible with democratic principles? And here's one answer that's given by political scientists is that yes, they are compatible as long as the policy area is not clearly redistributive. And here, for those who are interested, you can read the work of Giandomenico Maione, who gives specific criteria of how, if you have such, for instance, he talks about non-majoritarian institutions or independent regulatory agencies. You can have them, it's fine, they are ruled by experts, but as long as you have this clear criteria, they are not a problem for democratic legitimacy. The problems, however, come the moment in which you have a redistributive policy area. And one could say that, yeah, but the EU or even the internal market has redistributive consequences. That's true. But when it comes to fiscal governance, and especially the last 10 years or the first years of the Euro crisis, this has been very obvious, yeah, that there are redistributive consequences, and especially for the countries that have been the most affected by the Euro crisis and have received financial assistance, they are also the ones that felt this shock the most. And here it's good to always remember the Troika, because the Troika has been incredibly, so the Troika made of the Commission, the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and later, the European Stability Mechanisms. The Troika has been so disliked and has had such a negative reputation, with protests even organized in Greece and Italy against the Troika, creating this feeling that when experts get to decide who gets what, when, how, then public discontent ensues. And this is not to say, because also when I show the Leviathan picture, somebody from the ECB once told me, does this mean that the ECB is a sea monster? Not at all. So this is not something that I am trying to argue. On the contrary, I think that most people who work, so the experts who work in such institutions, they are professionally dedicated and want to do a good job. The problem appears that you follow rules, and there is evidence, economic evidence in going in certain directions. But the problem is that there's also significant room for discretion. Yeah, for example, in the excessive deficit procedure, there is this famous or infamous quote rather by Juncker with regard to the application of sanctions on France in 2016, when he said, we will not do this because it is France. And of course, this raises the issue, but shouldn't the rules apply to everyone? So the underlying problem here, one could say, is that, okay, so on the one hand, we have administrative discretion by experts in the application of fiscal rules, but an underlying problem, and this is something that authors like Dieter Grimm and Susanne Schmidt have underlined, is that in the Economic and Monetary Union, we have seen a constitutionalization of certain fiscal principles, such as the debt and deficit targets, that are open to political contestation, or would be normally open to political contestation in domestic arenas. So this is why we have these aspects of a redistributive policy area with administrative discretion, where we cannot debate whether these rules are the best rules, that create a lot of problems from a democratic perspective. So how can we move forward? So One issue in my work with Mark Dawson that we raise is that we have to stop comparing the EMU and the EU more broadly to national democratic settings, because we will inevitably be disappointed, and instead focus on accountability. And accountability, as of course, one could say it's the counterpart to delegation, but it also can be separated from delegation if you think that the type of accountability exercised by courts or administrative institutions such as ombudsmen or courts of auditors. So it's not only political accountability. And we talk about accountability goods. So maybe what we would want in the EMU political system is to actually see these goods achieved regardless of who exactly or how they are achieved, through political, legal, or administrative means. And the four normative goods that we talk about, or accountability goods, are openness, that we want fiscal governance to be transparent. Here, there's been a long discussion about the transparency of the European Central Bank or the Eurogroup, for that matter. Then with non-arbitrariness, I talked about the European Commission and its discretion in deciding on the excessive deficit procedure or the macroeconomic imbalance procedure. With regard to effectiveness, there has been a long discussion about the effectiveness of austerity measures or structural reforms, and how the euro area had such a sluggish growth in the years after, or still during the euro crisis. And finally, and this is probably the most controversial, is the aspect of publicness. So does fiscal governance act in the European public interest? And here, of course, I'm very cautious of, is there a European public interest and who gets to define it? Because we have national public interest, and this can actually be contrary to each other. We can think of the German-Greek dichotomy during the euro crisis, or during the COVID crisis, the frugal four against the rest. So having said that, I'm just looking, I would have one more slide, but I will briefly conclude and then leave it open if there are questions. So my main takeaway is that in the EU and the EMU specifically, there will always be a gap between what is normatively desirable and what is politically feasible. And to move forward, we have to change the focus from elections to what we call accountability goods. And I have a book coming up next year where I discuss the European Parliament specifically. And there, for instance, I look at the way in which the European Parliament exercises legislative oversight or scrutiny over the executive with various degrees of success. And two takeaways or two concrete recommendations that I make. Also, how to relate the goods if you think about, okay, these goods sound interesting, but how do we actually achieve them in practice? So one thing that I say, it would be very important for the Econ Committee to have a division of labor. So I'm not so much a fan of having a Euro area specific committee, because I think that would just be populated by MEPs according to seniority and not necessarily how active they are. Whereas a division of labor between MEPs, where they would take the lead in different economic dialogues or monetary dialogues or banking dialogues and so on, this would actually allow them to specialize on something and be able to, look at the effectiveness of the institutions or the non-arbitrariness of institutions. And the second thing that I propose is something that maybe the European Parliament can develop internally with the help of the Commission, since the Commission loves scorecards or scoreboards, is to have a redistribution scoreboard, to assess the consequences of fiscal decisions from a transnational perspective. Because if there is to be ever a European public interest, this has to be discussed, or at least politically made more transparent, of who gets to lose and who gets to win, and how do we decide this. I will stop here and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. What I propose that we do is quickly scan the room for questions, and then if they're short and perhaps also for clarification if it is needed. Otherwise, I suggest we move to the presentation by Francis Coppola, and we can integrate the insights from all three talks at the end in the discussion. I see none, so Ms. Coppola, please take it away.
Good evening, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk at short notice. As I've said already, I don't have slides, I'm afraid, so you'll just have to listen to me talking. And I hope I don't ramble too much. I think I want to take a little bit of a step back just for a minute from the fiscal rules themselves and the problem about sort of where do we go from here, having substantially suspended fiscal rules during the COVID crisis, sort of where do we go from here, to actually in a way look at how we got here. The construction of the monetary union is kind of founded on two things, really, from looked at from outside, as it were. The first really was the desire to separate money from state, money from politics, if you like. And that's a perennial desire that has been held by numerous people, not just in Europe, for a very long time, and attempted with varying degrees of success over the course of history, and it almost always fails. And that's ultimately because currency, money, is an expression of identity as much as a means of exchange or a means of facilitating trade. So to the extent that you create a money that is separate from the state, you are setting up an alternative to your national identity, and that's bound to create some degree of conflict. How much conflict it creates rather depends upon what happens next. So do you benefit from this monetary money, this money that is not produced by your state, but which you are expected to use and with which you identify to a greater or lesser extent? Or do you see it as an imposition or a cudgel with which to beat you? It's fair to say that so far in the European Monetary Union, those countries that have adopted the euro have not seen the euro itself as an imposition or a cudgel to beat them with. Those countries that have fallen foul of the fiscal rules and so forth have tended to blame the institutions rather than the currency itself. And so the currency has proved resilient to the various problems that the Eurozone has experienced in the last decade, somewhat to the surprise of a good many people, including, I have to say, me, because I was really quite critical of the euro, and being British, somewhat to the surprise for a good many people in Britain, who have frankly expected the whole thing to collapse. And I think that willingness to say, yes, okay, so we didn't create this money, but it's nevertheless ours, is, I think, a good part of what sustains the European Monetary Union. I was very struck dealing with Greece, how the commitment of the people of Greece was to staying in the euro. They just didn't like the rules. They wanted the rules to change so that they could stay in. And that's really what the referendum result was about. It was not about we want to leave the euro. It was not a vote to leave. It was a vote to change the rules. And that, I think, is what historically the institutions of the European Union have been quite bad at listening to, really. But I think that can change. And indeed, I think it's got to change, because otherwise, eventually, people will say, enough, no, we have to get out of this. So that would be my first observation, is that as time goes on, I think we'll find that the rather than creating a separation between money and state as was originally envisaged, the euro will come to be an identity, if you like, of a nascent state, nascent European state. And that's really, I think, where the fiscal rules are heading, because they are, in some respects, quite like the kind of fiscal rules that, say, America imposes on its states, the need to balance budgets, for example, which can be quite draconian. But the European Union has incomplete institutions and incomplete fiscal transfer mechanisms at the federal level. We're not there in terms of that common identity and therefore that common willingness to share risks. We're still thinking in terms of a national identity, a euro that is kind of supranational, but also national, and a set of rules that we quite like to change to suit ourselves. And every state in the European Union wants to change the rules to suit itself. And that, it seems to me, is the dilemma that you face with the fiscal rules. It's not dissimilar in that respect to the kind of arguments that my country is having with the European Union about trade, about whose rules are going to be dominant in trade. Are we going to agree a common set of rules? Are we going to have different rules and recognize each other's rules? And then what happens if one side changes the rules and the other side doesn't like it? Or are we simply going to go our own separate ways and not trade with each other? In a way, what happens inside the European Union with the fiscal rules is not dissimilar to that. You've been coerced in a way because of the crisis into adopting a set of fiscal rules that is really quite tight and quite intrusive. There is a lot of, as you say, as Adina was saying, a lot of technocratic involvement. There's a great deal of supervision, of surveillance. There are even sanctions. You know, you will be fined if you break these rules. And you think, well, how is that helpful? I think that was a little bit of a desperate crisis response. It was a response to the Euro crisis. It's often the way that when you have that kind of crisis, you respond by being very tight about things. You close ranks, you make it work. The Euro did nearly fall apart. And we have to reflect that. And in the end, nobody wanted it to. And so states agreed to these very restrictive set of rules in order to keep it together. But we have moved on a bit now. And in the last couple of years, I think people are more confident now that the Euro isn't going to fall apart. And secondly, there's been a belated recognition that actually the biggest threat to the Euro in many ways is fiscal rules that are too tight. Because if fiscal rules are so tight that a government cannot support its economy and the economy crashes and the country ends up defaulting on its debts and leaving the Euro because of that, then the integrity of the Euro has been broken. So some relaxation of the fiscal rules that you've been observing for the best part of the last decade, I think has not only been necessary over the last 2 years, but will be necessary going forward. And that's going to mean some kind of negotiation between the different states in the Eurozone to try and come up with a set of rules that you can all agree on and that are not too onerous for everybody. And I would rather it wasn't the kind of brutal and confrontational debate that my country's been having with the European Union, but because actually that would be in a way more damaging to the European Union than this kind of confrontation is between the UK and the EU is for either side, in that you're all in this together in a way that we're not. You need to actually come together as equal parties and agree a set of rules that you can all commit to. The first thing I would say in terms of identifying what those rules might be going forward, the first is that the SGP really does need to be revisited. The effect of the pandemic is going to be the public debt in all countries is going to be significantly elevated for a long time to come. So the 60% debt to GDP is simply not realistic anymore. Everybody's going to break it all the time. And we did have that rather unfortunate situation in the early days of the Euro when certain countries broke that rule and got away with it. And then in the Euro crisis, certain other countries broke the same rule and didn't get away with it. That's not fair. And it will be perceived as unfair. And those kind of unfairnesses put strains on your monetary union. So it is important that the rules do seem to apply equally to everybody. And that means that if there's rules that simply don't apply to bigger countries because nobody dares apply them, equally they can't apply to smaller countries either. And that has got to be accepted by everybody. I think that so as I've said, I think it is obvious that the Maastricht Treaty 60% to GDP rule is going to have to shift substantially, because absolutely nobody meets it. I think also the whole way you approach public deficits really needs to be rethought. And the reason for that is that it's strongly pro-cyclical at the moment. It's really noticeable that, you know, you kind of allow countries to run a 3% deficit in the bad times, but then they've got to pull back on it as soon as there's any sign of recovery, regardless of the state of the economy, on pain of sanctions. I find it rather amusing that in the run-up to financial crisis, the UK was actually put into what, had it been a member of the euro, would have been the excessive deficit procedure, because we had put forward a budget that was going to mean we ran a deficit of greater than 3% of GDP. It was just very slightly over at that time, and that was before the financial crisis. And the response of the UK Treasury was to say, well, we'll try to pull it back, but we actually are under no obligation to do so, because we only ever said we would endeavour to do so. And it seems to me that that kind of best efforts basis, endeavour, but not in a way that severely hurts the local economy, the welfare of local populations. This matters, and not in a way that damages local democracy, and not in a way that really is counterproductive, where you impose such tight fiscal restrictions that you actually delay the recovery of an economy from a recession. The UK's deficit subsequent to that shot up to something like 13% of GDP because of the financial crisis. And so the EU kindly allowed us 6 months to fix it, and then said, and we're going to come knocking on our door, making sure that you do. Now, we were still on will endeavour, but we did endeavour. And the front-loaded austerity that George Osborne applied to the UK economy from 2010 onwards was in part driven by that. And the price we paid for that in the COVID crisis was an NHS, a healthcare system, a social system that could not cope with the crisis. We have 10 years of underinvestment because of it. There are more important things than public deficits, that actually the welfare of the population and the resilience of institutions and social systems is more important than public deficits. And I think that is something that now needs to be learned from the crisis, from the COVID crisis particularly, that you need to rethink your measures of, shall we say, national stability, let's put it that way, that actually a country that is going all out to fix its deficit at the price of investment, of resilience, and of well-being actually is going down the wrong path and actually making itself less stable and less resilient rather than more resilient. So that's another thing I think needs to be born into these negotiations you need to have around your fiscal rules. And the third thing that I would highlight is risk sharing. I mean, historically, there's been a bit of an unwillingness to share risks in the Eurozone. And I think this is a kind of a measure of the fact that it's really a very young monetary union. Somebody pointed out in another discussion I had the other day that it took America 100 years to form itself into the kind of monetary union that it is now. You've been doing this for 20. Be patient with yourselves as you have these negotiations, and remember that, you know, it's early days. And also Europe has a very much longer history than America had at that time. America was a much younger continent. We have thousands of years of history and people whose national identities, tribal identities even, go back a very, very, very long time. And it will take a long time, I think, for those identities to coalesce to the point where you can agree to share risks. But somehow you've got to, because if you don't share risks, then everything falls apart. And when you're in crisis, you do end up sharing risks. The question is whether those countries that have the broadest shoulders will be prepared to cut the others some slack so that they can recover from the crisis without having to stamp heavily on the brakes, to mix a load of metaphors there. I'm sorry about that. I'm hoping that these comments have given a little bit of a framework for what I think is going to be quite an interesting time of renegotiation for the Eurozone, because there's no question you're going to have to renegotiate these fiscal rules. They aren't fit for purpose. And the question is where you go from here. And those, I hope, will give you some ideas about how I think this discussion can be framed and where I think it has to go.
Thanks so much for your gleeful plea for revision of the Stability and Growth Pact, among other European fiscal rules, and yeah, sort of providing a way forward, or also a bit of perspective with regards to these prospective negotiations on these fiscal rules that are sure to be yeah, the topic of much debate going forward. Just a short announcement before I will yield the floor to Professor Nicolaides and Stefano Merlo, is that if you already have questions, then please do feel free to send me those via the chat on Zoom so that I know where to find you after the last speakers. Having said that, Professor Nicolaides, Stefano.
Thank you, Diederik, and Stefano will put on share our slides right now. And let me just simply say that I'm here as the warming up act for the main band, who is Stefano Merlo, a wonderful scholar in the field. And I think, Stefano, I can speak in both our names to say that we very much agree with the gist of what Adina and Francis just said overall. And part of what we want to do now is put a bit of a kind of a theoretical frame on what we both share as analysis, but also prescriptions. And that frame, to a great extent, comes from, well, an intuition that I had about at the convention, the last one 20 years ago, which was very much to look at European democracy and say, how can we both defend it and critique it at the same time? And really try to escape, for the European level, as Adina just said, what I would have called at the time the tyranny of dichotomies, as if European democracy should be mimetic and look like national democracy, but also a second dimension, which was to say, look, European democracy is about the health of its national democracies. That's what it's foremost about, as well as finding a way of aggregating preferences at the supranational level. So on this basis, this is what the kind of intuition that led me and many others to develop a theory of democracy, to which many of us then applied the Euro crisis and asked, how can we understand this crisis through this conceptual lens? So the beginning, the foremost starting point here is to say that, as we've just heard, why it is a problem for national levels, that fiscal rules, as Francis was just saying, are seen as arbitrary external constraint over countries. Not only the Greeks have revolted. So how do we reform today to make them compatible with democracy at the domestic level? And even if we had the best fiscal rule, how do we get majorities, democratic majorities, the definition of a democracy, to follow them? Which institutional arrangements can help make them sustainable? So unfortunately, it's not so easy to say who should control monetary union. How do we get out of this dichotomy? Governments sitting around the table, intergovernmentalism, the Commission, supranationalism, non-majoritarian agents. How do we balance this consideration? So next slide. So just to come back to basics, European democracy, the idea that Europe as a democracy indeed moves away from this mimetic idea that either the EU is a set of democracies kind of alongside each other, therefore where you really reject constraints on each other, they're just in a perpetually fluid alliance, or a federal state in the making. And maybe that's a question for Francis, because you said, Francis, a moment ago, well, maybe this is a proto federal state. well, or maybe not. And the point about democracy is to ask, well, can we accept that the EU has been for decades in a transformative, not a mimetic logic, as a democracy, in a logic of opening up to each other's demoi? And that was a positive thing for a long time, that is just reinforcing each other democracies. But it turned into a pathology with the Euro crisis. And indeed, in that scheme, the third way means that we try to stay on this Rubicon. That is the challenge of the reform of monetary union. How can we stay on a Rubicon, neither back to separation, centrifugal and centripetal force of forever centralizing? So simply to put definitions back on the table, democracy has been defined, what I have defined it as union of peoples, understood both as states and citizens who govern together, but not as one. And that means, to go to the bottom of the slide, that we have these demoi who have their separate and different preferences, constrained logics of production, but in a democratic story needs to be empowered to counter the logic of financial market and technocratic drift, to empower each other. And that's the kratos, the governing together. How do you define enforcement mechanism that managed our democratic interdependence externalities without them being democratic preemption? And the condition of possibility for this impossible equilibrium to happen is this radical other regarding. And how do you institutionalize other regardingness, which is a lot of what Stefano's work is about. So before I turn to Stefano in a second, let me hint at what this leads to for vision of monetary union. So with monetary union, basically because of moral hazard and power asymmetries, the German approach, we have been in an interstate logic of conditionality, of managerial authoritarianism from both supranational and nationally guided supranational organization. And the drift has been through real covert rules that have had very little democratic anchoring, has been a supranational entrenchment of a conditionality logic, which is okay for the IMF when you're an external body, but when it comes from within, from your own political creation that becomes an enforcer of conditionality, as was just discussed, this is when the institutions becomes rotten from inside by monetary union. And so what the goal is of democratization is to come back to a trans-state logic, non-coercive way of managing externalities. That's the democratic. And in a nutshell, Francis was just talking about risk. That is the whole story of monetary union. It is the balance between those who really want to reduce risk, the frugals of this world, and make it a precondition for any kind of risk sharing, and those who say, look, you can't reduce risk in my country through austerity, etc., if you don't share the risk at the same time, including through counter-cyclical stabilization, what Francis was just talking about a minute ago, dealing with our budgets in a way that encourages growth rather than dampens it. And there would be much more to say about how you do risk reduction in a democratic way, but this is what connected to what Stefano is now going to go into.
Thank you, Calypso. And yeah, so I would like to kind of depart from this theoretical frame, which to me was particularly useful, also because I kind of came from the economic and kind of macroeconomic training, which was all about seeing statistics of all these different countries and not really going back to the thinking of what motivates these countries to choose these different policies, and how do you enmesh the different collective will formation at the European level. That to me seems to be one of the goals. And so what I'm going to argue and kind of look for is a new kind of economic constitution of the EMU to try and move towards this democratic idea, which is, again, staying in that center screen that we define as the Rubicon. So perhaps there was I should have put like a little sign that specified that it's, again, from that nice imagery that Calypso came up some time ago. So how do we manage then economic and fiscal externalities? So far, I would say that we've been a little bit stuck on a kind of a logic of consent and delegation. So most of the discussion that goes on, and I think also Francis had hinted at it, because it's a very intuitive moral reasoning, which is to say, let's decide on some rules. These rules will better be good. We've all internalized them because ultimately the parliaments have agreed to them, even the vilified Stability and Growth Pact, the Fiscal Compact, et cetera, they've all been passed by supermajorities in national parliaments at the end of the day. So if you give me my words that those rules are there, pacta sunt servanda, and therefore we should all play by these rules of the game. And my intuition is that consent is sometimes not enough, and surely in this case is not enough to provide enough democratic legitimacy. So again, member states have agreed on a set of rules, and in virtue of this promise, they should be constrained. If you've promised, now you have to deliver. But also from a Republican perspective, so the democracy also touches upon very interesting theory of freedom in philosophy, and the idea is that consent is sometimes not enough to justify interference. There's also a democratic problem with fiscal rules in a sense that whether you have the best ones, whether they are neoclassical, whether they're new Keynesian, whether they are the color that you prefer, it's still quite risky to add them to your own constitution, which is somewhat what has been done through the various fiscal compact agreed after the Eurozone crisis. And that's because we believe constitutions shouldn't be really there to privilege one worldview rather than another. And there's, I think, an argument that to me has quite a lot of traction, that these fiscal rules embody some strong ideas about how society should be. And so to that extent, there is something that is not really working if we try and, again, hammer on to the detailed of how to calculate the cyclically adjusted budget deficit, whether we should use a solo production function or someone else. And lastly, there's a problem that we already discussed, I think we touched upon in all presentation, with the intergovernmental character of decision-making. Adina has done amazing research on this, and she could elaborate much more than me on this point, but I think the basic message is that it's very hard to understand who is at the top of this process and how are actually powers administered. Who decides exactly on this flexibility of the European Commission? What goes on in those meetings when the heads of states meet all together? And so what I like to do is to have some sort of way of shaking up this picture, which I see as somewhat problematic, and move it towards a democratic frame again. So this might be a little bit of an idealistic setting, but just allow me to indulge in some of my own kind of reasoning, which again, have tried to take a lot of a very interesting discussion that happened in democratic theory between democracy and intergovernmentalism, supranationalism, and trying to see whether there's some way of bringing out some policy prescriptions. So my first kind of idea would be to move from rules to principles, to have some sort of principle-based economic constitution rather than a prescriptive and number-based fiscal rules as the ones that we normally consider. So the idea that these principles will be general enough so that they would not place certain views beyond the reach of democratic publics. So you wouldn't want to try and entrench some specific worldview of, for instance, what creates employment, what kind of fiscal spending triggers more or less deficit in the future, et cetera, et cetera. We also would want these principles because we want a way of framing our democratic discussion. we still want to have some boundaries and some rules that orchestrates our political interactions at the European level. And the reason why we also want some of these principles is that we might fear that these intergovernmental majorities could undermine our own capacity as citizens to be equal controllers of these public institutions. So the idea here is that if you have fiscal rules, it's probably a bit harder for countries in the Eurogroup or the Council to bully smaller ones that are maybe not complying or to interpret things in a different way. So it serves some sort of also kind of, I guess, some transparency function, in fact, of having some principle-based rules. And then second of all, away from the rules, more on the how do we administer them, I'd like to propose some, what I call a dual contestatory system at the policy-making level. And these are, again, some preliminary remarks, and I would like to kind of work on this a little bit more in the coming months. And the idea here being is that if we have executives at the top, as we do now with the Eurogroup and the European Councils, they really do need to be checked and contested at both levels. So at your national ones, through the institutions that we know, and also at the European level. What I would propose would be to have a European Parliament that is much more active in scrutinizing what happens at the EU level. So with these two elements, let me just kind of say a couple of more things, although I'm already have only 1 minute, so we're already running out of time. But the goal, again, as a last point, the goal is to keep executives in check, both at home, so what our governments do when they go to the European level, and at the EU level themselves as a collective. So I have kind of sketched some kind of principles that we kind of discuss a little bit later. I don't want to spend too much time, but so I'm just going to show them quite quickly. And again, so principle one is probably one of the key ones, and it's so general that it's kind of hard to kind of, I guess, hopefully disagree with it. And the idea is that national executives should consider the effect of their macroeconomic policies have on the EMU as a whole, and avoid those policies that make it prohibitively hard for other member states to reach their domestic economic objectives. So then it gets a little bit more intertwined, and I'm, again, very happy to hear some feedback on these ideas, because it's still quite preliminary. Point two would be that with regard to the first rule, national executive fiscal policies should not result in excessive accumulation of public debt that threatens the stability of the single currency. So still quite general. And rule three, so with regard to one, so again, the rule number one, national executive fiscal policy should not make it prohibitively costly for others, members to fulfill requirement number two. So again, these are very general and broad ideas that arguably one could say, yeah, sure, but how are exactly going to be interpreting prohibitively costly, excessive accumulation? What do these terms really mean? You know, if you have deficit bias, and we all believe, well, how are we going to escape the misbehavior of certain governments? Well, principle four is kind of tries to cover that. So the executive's interpretation of what these principles imply should be subject to enough parliamentary scrutiny and contestation. So I am putting more weight, rather than on the fiscal rules, on the political system that is meant to support them. That's kind of, I guess, one of the key ideas. And then I'm going to conclude, I'm not going to touch on the ECB, but I guess it kind of goes without saying that if you have this system, you must have a central bank that guarantees that countries will not go belly up, which is another huge discussion and opens up again. So I'm probably going to skip this slide given the time constraint. I just want to go more on the institution. So what does it mean? So two institutional changes that I like to suggest. One would be the empowering of what I call orchestrator fiscal councils at home. And my work with Cristina Fasone on this tried to kind of look a little bit more to zoom in exactly on what these fiscal councils should do. And the way I understand them is not the way in which we normally think about them, perhaps in the news. So these are not the disciplinarians that try to force countries in line, but rather they are domestic institutions that allow us as citizens to really force executives' position into the open. They're supposed to be orchestrators of macroeconomic policies because they allowed us to control our own executives. That's kind of the key idea. And again, there's a pretty big discussion on what exactly should these tasks be. And I mentioned a couple of them, so growth forecast, costing of executive spending, and what's also very important is their own institutional positioning. I would prefer to have parliamentary offices and independent agencies rather than attached to the government. And then at the supranational level, quite practically, but arguably not enough. I'm still kind of taking some steps on this direction, is to include the European Parliament in the macroeconomic surveillance process. The idea would be really to open up each other's polities to discussion about how should Europe move forward, rather than simply relying on this chain of legitimacy that we have between us, our executives, that then go to Brussels and discuss. The idea will be really to have some democratic opening at all of these levels. And I think I should conclude here and hopefully, hear some feedback and questions. So thanks a lot. I don't know if Calypso, you had anything to add on this, but otherwise I think I'd better stop here.
I'm good. You've illustrated, what other regardingness means and what combining the domestic and European level of scrutiny could mean. And I would just also signal that there's a proposal out there by Piketty and Vauchez in all about creating a monetary union parliament, a sub-part of the parliament, on which Stefano and I don't necessarily agree entirely, but is very important in bringing in national parliaments in this story.
All right, Professor Nicolaides, Stefan, thanks so much for your terrific presentation. I don't know if there's already any poignant questions in the audience. Otherwise, I'm going to give you some time to think it over and take this opportunity to ask one myself. And that relates to the dual contestatory system that Stefano talked about at the ending of his presentation, and perhaps how that relates with the notion of accountability goods as put forth by Professor Marikut Arpique, and whether those are actually two sides of the same coin, or how those would relate to each other, and whether this idea of a dual contestatory system could actually contribute to improving the accountability goods that Professor Marikut Arpique spoke of.
Yeah, well, I guess, as a first answer is that we actually haven't discussed among ourselves. I hope we agree, I guess. But there's definitely an overlap to the extent that bringing position into the open from the executive perspective relies on a notion of accountability. I come from a Republican perspective, so there's a lot of work in philosophy around this idea that popular control should be one of the key elements to allow our state not to dominate us. And Pettit discusses at length what he means by arbitrariness and non-arbitrariness. So I think there is some overlap, but I haven't actually thought completely through what the other three normative goods that Adina mentioned would kind of imply for my democratic frame.
Yeah, and I think I would agree to that. So I think that there's a lot of overlap, especially when it comes to our diagnosis of the problem. So what is missing from the current framework, democratic framework of the economic and monetary union. And I think that we both emphasize this aspect of contestation, that either through accountability. I think maybe where we differ is that you would also, or maybe you can tell me if I understood correctly, is it only a question of input? So do we want to bring parliaments in to influence the policy agenda, because accountability by nature is more of an ex post thing. Whereas we say it's fine if experts decide, as long as experts are reviewed, yeah, ex post facto, and as long as the mandates of what experts can do are also politically set. So I think that would be maybe my question to you.
Yeah, that's a very, I think it concerns more the fiscal council's parts of the presentation, and that's a very hard question, to the extent that you would want these independent agencies to command enough standing in a society as to be seen as some neutral umpire of a system of rules, rather than as politically appointed. But at the same time, because I see them as being part of a parliament, you cannot escape some political logic in their appointment. And I think you also hit on a somewhat of a blind spot in the theory of fiscal councils, to the extent that it's a very, very young kind of subject. They have been around, I mean, apart from the Dutch case, which has been around since forever, basically, the other fiscal councils have spread in the past 10 years. And it's still very much a big question of what exactly should they be doing. My normative theory kind of commits me to say that it's about scrutinizing, it's about really bringing that ministry out to provide information to parliaments so that they can themselves interpret that, rather than as a technocratic handling of specific policy levers. I'm not sure I've answered to your question, but that's kind of maybe one way to add something more to what you said.
And maybe to add, from a democratic viewpoint, I mean, the ex ante versus ex post issue really, does matter, to the extent that it shapes, expectations of the public. So if you say to the public, well, you will watch something unfold, and then the deciders will be accountable, it definitely creates a constraint. But unless and until you offer institutions and agents to which the principles, admittedly the public's, can refer, then I'm not sure we've gone all the way. So, I mean, I think your 4 principles, openness, non-arbitrariness, effectiveness, and publicness, are crucial and very important. But they're also, as you yourself said, Adina, very general. I mean, how do we define publicness? Who decides that you're acting on? That is the point of democracy, is what is the aggregation mechanism by which we define the European public interest? The whole logic, the whole self-perception of the well-intentioned technocrats who run monetary union is indeed that it is they who understand what the public interest is, and therefore we have to protect it from the public whim. So I'm not sure we can escape, the very structured kind of institutional proposals that we're kind of struggling with Stefano, and as well as, Antoine Bochez and others. I think they're totally compatible, but they need to complement each other. And I'm not sure we can simply rest on ex post accountability mechanism, or at least we need to specify how they are embedded in an ongoing way in certain institutional setups, such as a parliament of national parliaments, et cetera, and of course, fiscal councils of a certain type.
There's a question in the audience relating to both accountability goods and the expert rule in the EMU, both by Clara. So I'll give you the floor and let you decide which question you would like to ask first.
I probably go with the first one first, because I think it sort of follows up nicely after what we just discussed. So I was just wondering, Professor Mariko Dagvig, in your approach, like what would be your approach towards defining accountability goods more precisely? Like, who would design the goals they are supposed to achieve? I mean, it's sort of, it connects what Stefano discussed probably, but what would be your take on that issue?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the way in which we define the goods, it's essentially to say, I mean, I think that, for instance, when it comes to openness, that's quite clear what it means. Either openness of decision-making procedures or openness of finding out the content of decisions and its impact. It's more tricky when we talk about the other three. And it's true. So, for instance, when it comes to non-arbitrariness, so I think lawyers are much more strict about this, how they understand, how courts can limit or constrain discretion. When it comes to the European Central Bank, there is a big discussion between the Court of Justice of the EU and the national or the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany about how we can constrain the discretion of the European Central Bank. So I think that courts in this respect, or our answer to your question, is that different accountability forums might define these goods in different ways. And we cannot say a priori, this is what non-arbitrariness means. So we cannot say from the beginning, okay, this is how the European Central Bank acts in a way that is not discretionary. We don't even say that, okay, they shouldn't have discretion. That's would be also against the operational independence of central banks more generally. I think the trickier part is when it comes to who defines effectiveness and who defines publicness. Because, and here I have a good example of parliamentary scrutiny by the European Parliament vis-a-vis the Eurogroup in the economic dialogues, where I would say that the European Parliament, so because I looked at, in my work, I look at different types of economic dialogues, monetary dialogues, and so on. And actually the European Parliament does a fairly decent job of interrogating the Eurogroup president whenever he is present in Econ committee hearings. This happens only, unfortunately, twice per year, but they are the most prepared when it comes to the Eurogroup president, also because they understand, okay, maybe this is where the power lies, and that's also more interesting in terms of debating these things. So if you look at discussions that were held vis-a-vis the Cyprus financial assistance programs in 2013 or the Greek financial assistance program in 2015, I think that you could see MEPs from different political groups clearly prioritizing different notions of the European public good. The aspect, and this is where I find the limitation of my own work, how do we move from this fact that we obviously have competing visions of how the EU should look like, to which the Eurogroup president, I can say he because it was Dijsselbloem at the time, he would always, respond and justify the position of the Eurogroup, but then the position of the Eurogroup would not change necessarily, regardless of parliamentary majorities. So that is where I would see, and in this respect, I agree with both Calypso and Stefano that ex post accountability is insufficient if it's just parliamentary scrutiny, so exposing problems. We also should be able to do something to change, to impose consequences on the actors according to the different visions of the public good. And this is where I think, parliamentary majorities come into play.
That was a very complete answer to Clara's question, I believe. And there's broader question perhaps to Ms. Coppola, but also to the everyone on the panel, if you want to jump in, and we'll also move a bit away from accountability goods and more towards the criticism of expert rule in the EMU. It's also by Clara, so if you want to ask it yourself, then go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, because we were talking about expert rule in the EMU, and Francis, you said that fiscal policy is pro-cyclical, even though it delays recovery. And I was just wondering, how does that go together? Because if we have expert rule, we could actually expect to have like rule that aims at quick recovery. So, and that probably ends up quite nicely with the question of democracy and how different power, like different actors have different resources of power to sort of make their interests objectivized in the fiscal governance.
Yeah, I have a few things about that, actually. The first is that experts themselves are not necessarily expert. And at the time that the fiscal rules were put in place, there was quite a belief in expert circles that you could create growth essentially by through fiscal consolidation. There were actually academic papers about this, which were widely believed. And I think we have moved on from that. The proof of the pudding was that actually, no, it didn't. It actually made matters worse. But that was actually a belief among experts at the time. So experts are not necessarily omniscient, shall we say. Experts can be wrong. And I think part of democratic accountability actually needs to be to hold experts to account for the mistakes that they make. Because they make lots, and in the Eurozone crisis, they made a lot of mistakes, for which, to my mind, they have not been fully held to account. So that would be my first point. The second point would be this, really, that it's actually possible to have for your political, your ideology, like your political ideologies, and particularly your power imbalances within a setup like this, to override your experts. So you may have an expert saying, this is actually a really bad idea. You would be far better to allow a deficit to remain high for much longer and to pursue growth-friendly policies to give better support to your your population, to encourage small businesses, to pursue policies that promote full employment, things like that. The experts might be saying all of that, but in a setup like the Eurozone, you can actually have a situation where the political ideology or the political imperatives in a different country, because you're not yet a fully formed polity, really, can actually trump the views of experts. And we also saw that happening. So that's also a question of accountability flowing the other way, that somehow or another, the people of the Eurozone as a whole, as a polity, and particularly giving due weight to the views of minorities, and including that whole states of their actions are not just by their own immediate electorates, because a big problem. Sorry, are you able to hear me? Because I've got internet problems.
You dropped out briefly, but we were able to hear most of what you said.
One of the things that strikes me about so the whole conduct of the Eurozone crisis was actually that politicians were accountable to their own electorates, but not to the electorates of other electorates within the Eurozone. And somehow that's, I think, got to change, that politicians who are making decisions about fiscal rules that can be applied to other states within the Union have got to be accountable somehow to the electorates of those countries as well as to their own electorates. And we didn't see that happening very well in the Eurozone crisis. And that I think is something that needs to change. So it's I think also in a way coming with the accountability goods question, you have to actually find a way in which accountability of politicians is wider than it currently is. And I confess I don't know how you do that.
And I just say that that's what Stefano's fiscal councils are all about.
Yeah.
I mean, they are about, of course, doing accountability domestically differently, but they're also about including in the debate, educating in the debate, weighing, in the debate, in the national debate, the interests of others. That is the basic presumption of democracy. Democracy is indeed a vision of European democracy where democratic publics internalize the interest of the others, although we understand that it cannot be to the same extent necessarily as your own public, your own domestic public. So it's in that gap between the taking into the accountability to your own public and to others that we need to kind of find a way to think through that those institutions that will make this possible without turning the whole thing into one big constituency where all interests are weighed in the same way. No, it's normal that every national arena will focus on its national interest while looking at externalities. And this is why Stefano spelled out, his principle 1 and 2, and how it's about minimizing the cost of your externalities in various ways.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on one thing on the expert rule, because I think it was relevant, especially on fiscal councils. There's something quite interesting. So the fiscal council was sort of created to find what economists call the deficit bias. So these institutional distortions in democratic representations, and the different models that try to explain why would politicians ever borrow more than what they should. And what I'm trying to say in another piece of work is that in principle, there could be something wrong that is not economically wrong, but democratically wrong with deficit bias, to the extent that it shows some power imbalances or some asymmetry of information between rulers and citizens, between executives and parliaments. But once we have eliminated these informational asymmetries, once we really, we feel like we have a grasp of what our executives are choosing and why, then I do not feel like any expert should ever interfere with that process. Because how could even the incredibly smart macroeconomist, how could his own reasons be better than or more justified than the democratic ones, assuming again that there's no informational asymmetry between executives and those who rule. So that's, to me, is the kind of the function of those fiscal councils, more than to kind of show us the way in the messianic way, as if you wish.
Yeah. I'm skeptical about that, Stefano, I must admit, because information asymmetry is a fact of life. We never ever manage to eliminate it completely, and in fact it's awfully easy for powerful for powerful politicians, powerful media outlets, powerful experts even to seize the popular imagination, to get a message across and control the message, control the signal. Information is, I'm not disputing what you're trying to do. I just question how achievable it is in practice, given that we can never ever eliminate information asymmetry.
But can I just add one point here about the national versus supranational expertise? There's an example I always love is the way in which the European semester tried to get Belgium to revisit its wage setting system, by saying that, it was actually inflationary. But in fact, people in Belgium knew that it was disinflationary because it created a kind of consensus around social partners, et cetera. I'm not going to go into the details. And so for 3 years, the EU, under the Stability and Growth Pact and the semester was asking Belgium to change until somehow the penny dropped. And they realized that experts and publics, and especially social partners, were saying at the domestic level of one of their member states. So it wasn't a question of preference of run amok, deficits, but really a deeper understanding. And we need to have a subsidiarity, bias here, that very often local partners understand better the logic. Of course, there are conflicting interests, obviously, but we also want to come back to these differences between where the experts are located.
I also wanted to jump in just in relation to this question that Francis raised about, speaking to other publics, in other member states, because I think my idea of the redistribution scoreboard is very much consistent with that, because I think what we need much more, and this is also the point that Stefano was making with fiscal council, is to raise awareness about the redistributive consequences of fiscal decisions, because it might be that citizens are simply not aware of it, or we think, and I mean, the whole literature that's on transnational solidarity speaks about this. How do we create it? Where does it come from? And I was thinking, just reading what's going on with the conference on the future of Europe, our citizen panel, an answer to this, so putting together panels of citizens that discuss these impacts of redistribution across member states. Will this lead to a better understanding of the consequences of fiscal decisions? Will this maybe change political preferences? I don't know, but it's always hard to make recommendations, concrete reforms for the economic and monetary union, because always there's, this could work, but we cannot implement it because of X, Y, and Z.
Can I just make one more comment, which is actually also to do with information asymmetry and incomplete information, actually, and also the way in which information can be politicized. I want to give an example. So, for example, when we talk about the European periphery crisis and Ireland, we very much, the language is often about fiscal transfers to these countries from the large countries, and how unpopular that is in countries like Germany, who think they ought to sort themselves out and stand on their own feet and not be supported by bigger countries, right? And what never gets mentioned is the fact that the banking systems of these larger countries were supported by these smaller countries, particularly Ireland, but also Italy, Spain, and Greece. And that has become almost like a political taboo. The idea that actually there was a bailout that went the other first, and that, as one friend of mine who actually is an investor said, they basically wanted to dump the cost of bailing out of bailing out the European banking system on Greece and Ireland. And that's become a political taboo, saying that kind of thing. But in actual fact, there is this kind of reciprocity. There are deficit biases. There are also surplus biases, and surplus bias creates deficit bias. So you have to look at it in the round. You have to look at all of it, and in a way try and get away from this kind of sort of one-upmanship that we get into sometimes, is saying, oh, this is a surplus country, that's good, that's a deficit country, that's bad, and try and see that actually they're simply two sides of the same coin. That that country's got itself in a bit of a mess from a fiscal point of view. It needs fiscal needs to be dragged back to fiscal soundness, but not really any mention of those countries that are persistently running surpluses, which is actually causing a lot of that problem. Until you actually get this kind of reciprocity thing, and the fact that you're all in this together, and that one person's surplus is one country's surplus is another country's deficit, and so forth. Until you get that, you're always going to have this kind of asymmetry between countries, and I find it very difficult, I think, to come up with a set of fiscal rules that everybody can really consistently buy into without when they're not facing an existential threat, which the last time they were looked at was what, of course, the Eurozone was facing.
Can I just say, Francis, that's why I am a great fan of Adina's proposal for a scoreboard, because we've been hammering on this question of, ever since Keynes and the post-war debates, it's always been this question of asymmetry between surplus and deficit countries and the costs that it creates, and for both sides, actually. So, and that's one of the very big problem with German public opinion, is that they don't internalize the cost to others or the cost to themselves and the benefits that they derive. They only see the cost of giving money to these profligate countries, but they don't know the benefits that it yields, and nor the cost of creating these surpluses. So all of this, speaks to Adina's proposal, which I applaud.
Well, perhaps that's a very nice way to end it. We've covered so much ground tonight, from accountability goods to this wonderful idea of a scoreboard, to the need for revision of the Stability and Growth Pact, and this again also wonderful proposal of this dual contestatory system proposed by Stefano, which and I hope that all these proposals also benefited from interacting with each other, and that we can, as long as these wonderful ideas are being discussed, then at least I, as a mere spectator, am very hopeful about the future of the fiscal rules in the EMU. There's also a question by Frank from the organization, whether all participants would be willing to send their PowerPoints along. For Francis, that's of course not possible, but the video has also been recorded, so your wonderful contribution will not be lost, I presume.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks everyone for attending this event, and thanks to all contributors for their wonderful contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.